Welcome to the third episode of Eye on Academia, a monthly podcast presented by the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center is dedicated to the reporting and analysis of higher education events, policies, and trends. I'm Jay Shallon, the host for today, and a senior fellow with the Martin Center. Higher education's influence on the intellectual life of the nation is hard to overestimate. It is where most new ideas are conceived, incubated, and spread to the general population. If you don't like the direction the nation is moving in any aspect, political, cultural, educational, and so on, chances are you have academia to thank, at least in part. Therefore, our colleges, universities need eyes on them so that they can operate in secrecy and use their influence to undesirable ends. We hope this program serves just that purpose. For today, members of our team of higher education analysts have each picked a recent story or event to discuss. This month, their choices indeed reveal how higher education is becoming a battleground of ideas, or perhaps a battleground over the policies that represent those ideas. Without further ado, let's meet them. First up will be Jenna Robinson, who has been the president of the Martin Center for 8 years. She will be followed by Graham Hillard, the managing editor of the Martin Center. And last but not least, we have Shannon Watkins, who is a full-time writer and researcher and has been with the Martin Center for 6 years. So Jenna, I guess you've got kind of a hot button issue here in North Carolina to start with. Why don't you go ahead?
Right. At the end of last year, Governor Roy Cooper, governor of North Carolina, created a new governor's commission on the governance of public universities in North Carolina. And this was a little bit surprising because legally, Governor Cooper doesn't have any authority over the appointment process for the UNC system, which is what this commission is supposed to address. The North Carolina General Assembly appoints all the members of the UNC Board of Governors. Between the House and the Senate, they share that appointment process. And so the governor looking into this is surprising because there's really nothing he can do. And as soon as the news broke that the governor was going to do this, people from the House and the Senate said, essentially, we're going to ignore his recommendations. The North Carolina General Assembly is made up of Republicans. Governor Cooper is a Democrat. They've been at cross purposes on a lot of issues, and this is just one of them. And so the General Assembly already said that they're not going to pay any attention to what he and his commission are going to suggest. So it really seems like a pointless exercise. One person I was talking to about it said maybe this is just part of his election campaign for the future. He gets to tell people on the left that he's doing something about all of the horrible problems caused by Republicans in our UNC system. And, you know, that's as good a guess as any as to why he is doing what he is doing. I don't expect it to actually, make any real reforms. Some of the things that the commission is interested in include diversity on the UNC Board of Governors. Of course, having quotas on the UNC Board of Governors is illegal. In the past, there were rules about trying to pick women and minorities for the board, and those were actually scrapped because of concerns about equal opportunity laws. And so, they would really just be taking us backwards, but that is something that they can continue to talk about, is getting more superficial diversity on the board, as well as they do want viewpoint diversity on the board too. But I think they're more concerned about that superficial level of diversity. And in the article I wrote about, I think the most interesting thing that happened at the second or third meeting of the commission is that SAC's COC president, Belle Whelan, used her platform there to really take a dig at UNC Chapel Hill's new School of Civic Life and Leadership, essentially without knowing anything about it. She said she read some reports in the press and was going to send them a letter. And, when pressed, she said she hadn't read the resolution about the new School of Civic Life and Leadership at UNC Chapel Hill. She was getting all this from the media, which of course had really biased reporting, especially there at the beginning. The News and Observer has run, multiple op-eds against the new school. And so in this, SAC COC is just running with the left of center faculty narrative, and really trying to undermine the current governance and the current trustees at UNC Chapel Hill and at the board. And so it's been an interesting time seeing all the responses to that, over the last month or so.
We should be clear here that SAC COC is the accrediting body for all of the UNC system schools. And so there's a kind of irony here in that even though Governor Cooper's commission doesn't have any political power, SAC COC does have power. And so when they bring in Belle Whelan to speak to this commission, even if that's just intended as a political stunt, well, she could do things that put UNC Chapel Hill in a bind. And so I think that she's overplayed her hand. I'm sure we'll talk more about that in a moment. But I think that maybe the most interesting thing is that in trying to pull this political stunt, the commission has, they're in a sense playing with fire. They're bringing in someone who could do damage and who must be reckoned with. And in this case, I think resisted by the college.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that her comments there at that commission, were kind of a threat to UNC. We don't like what you're doing, back off, or we're not going to accredit you. And this is a move that SACS has pulled more than once with colleges in Florida and with South Carolina. I don't think it's much of a surprise that, SACS is kind of a bully when it comes to what it tells colleges to do. And it may sound like, well, they're the accrediting agency, they should be telling colleges what to do. But most of what they are using their authority to do isn't just simple, financial oversight or curricular, making sure that colleges are actually offering real curriculum or anti-fraud or any of the things that we might want an accreditor to do. I mean, they're really bullying colleges to do things that suit their political interests.
Yeah, Jenna, in your article, you linked to an open letter that Peter Wood addressed to Whelan, and I took a look at it. In the case, he was referencing her influence in Florida State University's selection of a new president. And she wrote a letter to the board there cautioning them from considering or hiring this candidate, and who was a current member of the board, governors, I believe. And there were two grounds for caution, but the most egregious one was that the candidate didn't have sufficient academic experience or sufficient credentials. She more or less implying like, oh, well, he's not an academic career person, so he can't qualify. And that, of course, is, excluding anyone who isn't, who is outside of academia. There are plenty of people who have the ability to govern, maybe even from a better perspective than someone who's just been in the academy all their life.
Mitch Daniels, just to think of one.
Who?
Mitch Daniels is
exactly.
a great example of a college president who doesn't come from the typical PhD college university life background and has done a great job. So yeah.
And well, ironically, the person they were trying to replace also didn't fit that description. So that was, interesting. But Peter, in his open letter, said that she more or less hinted very strongly that if they didn't listen to her on this question, that it would potentially threaten their accreditation status, which is, as Graham said, extremely serious. That can have extremely financial consequences for an institution.
Yeah. Although it's hard sometimes to take SAC seriously when they make these threats, since this is the same organization that did nothing to UNC for offering fake classes. And so if they're not going to do anything to you for offering fake classes, then, what authority do they stand on? It's hard to say, but I think what will be interesting going forward, not here in North Carolina, but is for us to look to Florida, where there has been a recent bill that says that the schools have to switch accreditors from time to time. Of course, colleges in Florida are currently all accredited by SACS. So I don't know what the timeline is for this, but sometimes in the near future, Florida schools are going to be looking for a new accreditor. And I look forward to seeing how that plays out.
I wanted to push back a little on, SACS is just ineffective because not offering bogus classes or whatever they did at UNC that SACS ignored, to them is not a crucial thing. But what we're talking about is, this is about who controls the universities. And that to them is super important. This was purely a power grab by the governor. And since he didn't have any actual power, he went and found his big brother or whatever, who's much bigger and stronger than him and has some real power. And so in something like this, I think you will tend to see SACS show a little more, some more teeth, because their citadel, their main source of everything is being threatened. So, bogus classes, no big deal. Threatening to take power, to reform the universities using the legitimate power of the people, not so, that's no small matter to them.
Yeah. Well, I think that, SACS should keep in mind that here in North Carolina, there's no law requiring that universities use SACS COC as their accreditor. They are free to choose which accreditor they want, and probably should.
And which is, that would be the power of the people taking their power back. Shannon, you were going to add something?
Yeah, so I was reading up a little bit on what happened in Georgia, because she also tried to influence the selection process of the University of Georgia system president, I believe, who was one of the candidates was Sonny Perdue, and she was worried that there was politicization going on there, undue pressure in considering him. And well, they did pause the process for a time, but he did end up becoming president there. So I wonder if that was an instance where they didn't really follow through on their subtle threats.
Could be. So anyway, okay, so now we're going to go on to Graham. And Graham, you are looking at just one more example of the grand leveling process or project that higher education seems to be undergoing. Why don't you fill us in on that?
Yeah, so this was a story that broke a couple of weeks ago. Columbia University has now decided to become the first Ivy League institution to go permanently test optional. And of course, what that means is that they are no longer going to require applicants to send SAT or ACT scores for undergraduate admissions. Now, our listeners probably recall that a lot of these test optional policies initially came about because of the pandemic and because of, whatever you think of it, the initial explanation was that we were going to try to ease the way for students whose test taking and test preparation processes were being interrupted by COVID. Obviously, that's no longer the case. And so what we have instead, in my view, and I'd love to hear what the rest of you think about this, is colleges looking ahead to the affirmative action Supreme Court rulings that we can expect to see in June, assuming that those rulings are going to go against them and that they will no longer be allowed to explicitly consider race as one factor in admissions, and asking themselves, well, if we're no longer going to be able to consider race explicitly, how are we going to continue to try to craft the student bodies that we want? And the way that they're going to try to do that is to get rid of any objective meritocratic measure like SAT or ACT scores, and turn instead to completely subjective things like essays. And so you have Columbia leading the way, abandoning any pretense that this was ever about COVID. In fact, it's about looking ahead to the Supreme Court's overturning of certain affirmative action processes.
Yeah, I think you're right, Graham. I don't think this is about COVID at all. I think COVID gave them an excuse, gave a lot of institutions an excuse to do what they wanted to do anyway, which was to get rid of the one objective test that was actually comparable across schools, across states, across people, and go to a wholly subjective process. And that's what they really are after, a subjective process. I mean, they call it holistic, but what it really means is the ability to make our student body look exactly the way we want it to, whether that is exactly where they want it to in terms of race, or in terms of politics, or in terms of their parents' ability to pay, in terms of ability to line their pockets or get foreign students. Having a holistic admissions process is the way to do that. And they don't mind keeping grade point average as a criteria, because there has been so much grade inflation in high schools and in colleges, of course, too. There's been so much grade inflation in high schools that everybody gets an A now. So you can say that, we only accept people with a 3.5 GPA. Well, congratulations, that's half the country. So it's really not a limiting factor at all to keep GPA, whereas an SAT score or an ACT score, for all of the flaws that the SAT and the ACT and the College Board have, still maintain their predictability and the comparability across, across students. And that's something that colleges just don't want.
No, they don't want that. And I mean, pre-COVID, the University of North Carolina system was already going down this path. They were in the works was this policy to make, not technically, but the SAT or ACT optional, because instead of requiring that students meet a certain threshold for GPA and SAT, they wanted to change it so that, well, they'll have to meet either a threshold, a minimum GPA of 2.5 or a minimum SAT score of X, instead of having to meet both. Students were still going to have to submit scores, but more or less, in retrospect, it totally looked like they were going down the path of test optional. And it's interesting that Columbia used, I think in the article, Graham, that you sent, they cited the need for flexibility as a reason for changing, for keeping test optional. And funny enough, UNC staff said the same thing back in 2019, 2018, the need for flexibility. And I don't understand, that doesn't really make sense when you're thinking about standards. Standards are not meant to be bendable. They're not meant to be malleable. They're meant to be standards. You don't want them to be flexible. So I think it's funny that they say that in the first place. But I remember when I was reporting on this a few years ago, I was consulting the latest research on, okay, well, what is the better predictor, GPA or SAT? And it's true, like if you look, at least at the time I was reporting, if you look at the data, if you're looking at one predictor of academic ability, GPA alone does seem to be a better predictor if you're going to look at one or the other. But as researchers, Nathan Kunsel and Paul Sackett have pointed out, that an even better predictor is using both of them together. And that's just a fact that UNC staff and everyone else who's pushing this policy are ignoring.
That's sort of like if you're assuming that one predictor is best, so just use that. And other studies have said that other tests might be better, but we'll even accept the fact that they're claiming the GPA is the best predictor. But it's kind of like if a boxer has, their right hand is a much stronger punch, so they never throw a punch with their left hand. It's kind of the same as that. And, I'm sorry that I don't think there's a boxer in the world who's ever employed that method. And if they did, they never won. So it's kind of like that, they're completely fallacious way of thinking.
Yeah, I think we should also point out here that, one of the things that people often say about an SAT or an ACT is that it is highly correlated with parental income. And so we should get rid of it. But what they want to replace it with, essays and extracurriculars and all these holistic admission standards are even more correlated with parental income. Because I mean, who has money to buy their kid a ukulele or a violin, taking the lessons, the time to take them to lessons, the time to devote to all of these extracurriculars, the time to pay someone to tutor their child to write good essays or even have their essays checked over by a professional. All of these extracurricular things are far more expensive than one SAT prep course, because it's something that you have to do for your whole life to get them in a position to do all these extracurriculars and be able to be, ready to shine on the applications. And so I think that, if they use that as an excuse, it's just completely disingenuous. And of course, we know from all of the data that came out during the Harvard court case that Harvard, even when it's advantaging some minority groups over the others, they are looking for members of those minority groups who are wealthy. And so most of the people that they are letting in, saying, or, admitting to the class who are on paper minorities are coming from the same type of upper class or middle class families that their legacy students do. And so they're not achieving any kind of economic mobility that they say they are by employing the racial preferences that they do.
One thing to note here is that the Ivies, of course, are looking at what each other are doing, and so Columbia is just going to be the first domino to fall here. That story I sent you all may have seen. Harvard University is test optional up through the class of 2030. That's the next incoming 5 freshman classes. The idea that Harvard, after the 2027 freshman class comes in, is going to say, all right, we're going back to tests, is ridiculous. They will never have test requirements again unless they're somehow forced to by some kind of external circumstance or authority.
Well, I was really excited to see that MIT they almost went test optional, and then they changed their minds immediately and said they're bringing back the tests. And I actually read in Princeton Review today that MIT is now the #1 choice of elite students. So, maybe not everyone has totally lost their minds.
Also talking, go ahead, Shannon.
Well, I always like to say in any discussion about SAT going optional, these institutions clearly have their own reasons for why they want to institute these sort of policies. But I find it very disingenuous when they argue that it's for the benefit of students, because introducing more subjectivity into the admissions process does not help students. It's putting students in a position where they're not at the level with their peers. And so they're immediately going to be at the bottom of their classes in most cases. And students who are academically underprepared, who are admitted into these institutions, or are more likely to not graduate, to drop out before earning a degree, and they're also likely to have debt. So no credential and debt. This is not helping students. It's putting them in a terrible position.
And going back to what Graham was saying, this is opening up an opportunity for other schools who are saying, "Oh no, we're depending on the tests as much as ever or more," and so they can start to develop a reputation for excellence through getting the students who are the highly qualified students who are being rejected at these currently elite schools. So there is an opportunity for them to advance themselves in that way. Another thing I thought is, in the past, when this first started occurring, this was a way of gaming the system. Like Wake Forest saw a rise in SAT average. They still used average SAT scores in their rankings and whatever. So what happened is students with low scores don't submit them where the students with the high scores do. So lots of schools that went test optional saw their average test scores rise. So it was a way of gaming the system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those rankings are nonsense anyway, but this is just another example of how easy it is for schools to, come up with whatever they want.
Okay, well let's move on to Shannon, who is becoming our local reading expert. So let's hear what she has to say.
So I recently reported on some dismal data from the UNC system. It was on their teacher prep programs on how they're teaching literacy. Now, just for context, literacy amongst K through 12 students in the state is not great, and I know nationally is very grim as well. But just to look at some stats real quick, according to the 2019 NAEP reading assessment scores across North Carolina, only 36% of fourth graders can read at a proficient or better level. 36%. That number dropped to 33% for eighth graders. Okay, so reading literacy is a mess in the state. Clearly, the way that teachers are teaching literacy is not working, and efforts to improve literacy instruction are crucial. So we can understand why the UNC Board of Governors were not happy at a recent board meeting about 2 months ago, when they were presented with the results of an audit by a third-party evaluator called TPIUS. They looked, well, the result of this evaluation was mandated by the legislator as part of the legislation that was passed in 2021. And the UNC system was told to initiate this evaluation with the contractor for the 15 ed prep programs in the UNC system and 15 from the independent schools in the state. Now, they focus mostly on the results of the UNC schools, understandably, and the results were really bad. The schools were supposed to, over several years process, starting in 2017 through now, there has been this whole project of committees and subcommittees to decide, okay, what is the best way to teach? The best way to teach reading is through the science of reading. The science of reading is kind of a catch-all phrase that includes teaching reading instruction, that includes phonological and phonemic awareness, so phonics, and spelling, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Now, the UNC system programs were asked by the Board of Governors to align their curriculum with a literacy framework that was previously established, I think in 2021, by another UNC system committee. And they didn't do so well in aligning their curricula with the literacy framework. The contractor found that only UNC Charlotte was found to be strong. And then I believe it was there were 5 schools that received a good rating. And then the remaining 9 programs either received a needs improvement rating or inadequate. It turns out there was only one school, I believe, that needs was inadequate, and it wasn't mentioned during the meeting. And of course, President Hans of the UNC system was appalled by these findings. The Board of Governors were appalled. It resulted in a resolution that was unanimously passed that more or less says that these ed prep programs have to get in shape. They need to get in shape, align their curricula with the literacy framework by this July. So by July 1st of 2023, all UNC system educator preparation programs in elementary and special education general curriculum will have addressed areas in need of improvement. And it goes on to say that that if they do not do so, if they do not produce adequate evidence of improvement by then that institution's dean, provost, or chancellor will be required to present at the next educational planning committee meeting. And now I kind of want to ask, well, what kind of enforcement is that? They have to present, then what happens after that? There doesn't really seem to be any real consequences as far as I can see for these institutions.
And those presentations are a punishment for the audience as much as for the person who's being forced to present. I have on my screen right now an update on UNC System Literacy Initiatives. It was given to the board's Educational Planning Policies and Programs Committee in October of last year. And it is just 100 pages of unreadable jargon clearly intended to bore the board into submission. And I think that any kind of punitive forced presentation is going to be more of the same.
One of the problems is that all of the education experts or reading experts that they have to produce this material have been educated in the same manner. So it's just this constant cycle of, producing people who produce jargon, and at some point somebody has to step in and say, no, we have to end this cycle of abuse.
Agreed.
Well, I think when the legislature was doing this bill about the science of reading, they were trying to get it right. They were trying to get the curriculum for reading out of the hand of these educrats who have been doing it wrong, who pushed, whole language and sight words and, balanced literacy or whatever they're calling it these days, in favor of teaching kids phonics. And, the sad thing is that, they keep having to do all these follow-ups because the education schools just don't want to implement this program that works.
Well, this is the old soft governance versus hard governance problem once again, where although the legislature proposes laws, rules, whatever, it goes down through the board, and if there's an established hierarchy that is supposed to work, but down at the bottom, people are saying, no, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. They claim to have academic freedom that supports their right to do what they want in the classroom, although that is a false concept. The courts have consistently said that the institution has the right to control what's in the classroom in a public university. So this is kind of, we're seeing the two major factions of faculty and legislature / board kind of coming together and meeting in an alleyway for a brawl. And it'd be interesting to see who eventually wins that brawl.
Yeah, and I raised the question in my article. I often see these proposals for improving reading by use of the science of reading, which is fantastic. I mean, bringing back phonics, let's do it. I'm a linguistics major, but there's very little discussion I find on what is the content of these curricula, like what exactly are students learning? Because as Edie Hirsch will say, background knowledge, knowledge of specific coherent information is crucial for reading and reading comprehension. And so even though UNC's literacy framework does a lot of good in emphasizing phonics, phonemic awareness, I didn't really see much mention of specific knowledge. And so I do think that is a lack in the proposal.
Yeah, I think you're right there, and that's a broader ed school and K-12 issue, and I think that you see it in Common Core too. That there's all this concern about document literacy, but they don't care much about which documents you're reading. And I really like, there's an analogy that E.D. Hirsch likes to use, and I think it's a great one, or it's a story. He actually, not an analogy. He says they did an experiment about which kids did better on reading a passage about baseball. And it turns out that students with a lot of knowledge about baseball did better in reading comprehension on the passage about baseball than children who were really, really good in, generic reading skills, phonemic awareness, all of these other things that we like. But it shows you that having content knowledge plus phonemic awareness is what you really need for true reading comprehension. And I think that, right now the schools are doing a terrible job of both. The legislature has addressed this one part of it, but they still do need to address the other piece.
It would seem if they were really, if the state was really taking this seriously, and unfortunately you have so many different factions, you have the Department of Public Instruction, I think that's the DPI people who run K-12, you have the EDGE schools and all this, but it would seem to me that if you had a curriculum that synced up reading with what students were learning in their other subjects, you would kind of get past that problem where students are unequally prepared for school. Because one reason that more prosperous students tend to do well is because they've been exposed to so much cultural knowledge at an early age, whereas not so much for the low-income kids. So some way of syncing things up so that students had that they were being given the knowledge they needed to know to read, and they were reading about things that they knew. And
Right.
so it would both would kind of bolster each, because we all know that at some point reading is no longer taught, and you read to learn. And I think this would prepare people in that path.
Right. And they've gone completely the other direction, though, because in K-12, when you're learning to read, they have jettisoned all other topics. So there's nothing to sync it up with. All they're doing is like literacy and math and learning how to sit down and behave in a classroom. They're not actually doing history or science or geography or any other what we would call content in those early grades, because they're spending 3 hours a day on literacy that doesn't necessarily work if they're not doing it right.
Graham?
This is not a podcast of four literacy experts, but I think where our concern is, if the legislature has ideas about how to fix literacy instruction, can the public schools of education be made to conform to what they're being told by the law, by legislatures to do? And the answer so far seems to be no, that they're just going their own way and refuse to be led by, the public, essentially.
Right. Well, DPI actually authorizes educator prep programs. And I think, that's the stick. We were talking about SACS just a little while ago about how it actually does have real authority. The Department of Public Instruction has real authority too. If education prep programs are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, the Department of Public Instruction can refuse to reauthorize them. Now, I don't think there's probably the political will to do that, but it's there. That authority is there and it does exist. It's just that it hasn't been used.
Okay, well, we seem to have covered that topic for today. Anyway, I'd like to thank all four of our participants, including myself, because math is hard. I just miscalculated there. And so anyway, we hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please like, follow, share, subscribe, or even say something nice about us in the comments. And if you want to see the full range of Martin Center contact, please visit our website at www.jamesgmartin.center. Thank you.